The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sarah Martinez walked silently through the corridors of the Naval Special Warfare Command. Her boots made soft clicking sounds on the polished floor, but she never spoke a word to anyone she passed. Other service members would nod or say good morning, but Sarah would only respond with a slight nod of her head. This had been her routine for the past 3 years. Sarah was 28 years old and had been serving in the Navy for 8 years. She worked as a communications specialist, handling some of the most sensitive information that passed through the base. Her job required precision, attention to detail, and absolute discretion. What her colleagues didn't know was why she had stopped speaking to anyone beyond the absolute minimum required for her duties. The story began 4 years earlier when Sarah was stationed at a different base in California. She had been a bright, talkative young woman who loved her job and got along well with everyone. Her supervisor, Lieutenant Commander James Reed, seemed impressed with her work and often called her into his office for what he claimed were performance reviews and special assignments. At first, Sarah felt honored by the attention. Reed was respected throughout the base, and having him notice her work seemed like a good sign for her career. He would praise her intelligence and dedication, telling her she had real potential for advancement. Sarah worked hard to maintain his approval, often staying late to complete the special projects he assigned to her. But, gradually, the meetings began to change. Reed started making comments about her appearance, telling her she looked nice in her uniform or asking about her personal life. Sarah felt uncomfortable, but didn't want to seem ungrateful or difficult. She had worked hard to get where she was, and she didn't want to jeopardize her position over what seemed like harmless comments. The situation escalated over several months. Reed began calling her into his office more frequently, sometimes for meetings that seemed to have no real purpose. He would stand closer to her than necessary when reviewing documents, and his compliments became more personal and inappropriate. Sarah tried to maintain professional boundaries, but Reed seemed to interpret her discomfort as shyness rather than rejection. One evening, Sarah was working late to finish a report when Reed appeared in her workspace. The building was nearly empty, with only a skeleton crew on duty. He told her he needed to discuss something important in his office, and, reluctantly, Sarah followed him. What happened in that office that night would change her life forever. Reed closed the door behind them, and immediately began making advances that were clearly inappropriate. When Sarah tried to leave, he blocked her path and made it clear that her career advancement depended on her cooperation. Sarah was trapped, both physically in the room and professionally in an impossible situation. She knew that reporting a senior officer could destroy her career, especially without witnesses or proof. The next few months were a nightmare for Sarah. Reed continued to abuse his position of power, calling her into his office regularly and making her life miserable when she tried to resist. She became withdrawn and anxious, her work began to suffer, and she started having trouble sleeping. Her friends and colleagues noticed the change in her behavior, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to explain what was happening. Sarah tried several times to report the situation through proper channels, but each attempt was met with skepticism or outright dismissal. Reed was well-connected and respected, while Sarah was just another junior enlisted person whose word carried little weight against his. The few times she managed to speak with someone in authority, she was told that she must have misunderstood Reed's intentions or that she was being too sensitive. The breaking point came when Sarah finally gathered the courage to file a formal complaint. She spent hours documenting incidents, dates, and details, hoping that a written record would be taken more seriously than her previous verbal reports. She submitted the complaint through the proper channels and waited for an investigation to begin. Instead of an investigation, Sarah was called into a meeting with Reed and his superior officer. They told her that her complaint was unfounded and that she was being transferred to another base effective immediately. The transfer was presented as routine, but Sarah understood it for what it really was, punishment for speaking up. Reed's career continued unchanged, while Sarah was uprooted from her life and sent across the country. The transfer to the new base should have been a fresh start, but Sarah carried the trauma with her. She had learned that speaking up led to retaliation, that her word meant nothing against those with power and connections, and that the system she had sworn to serve was not designed to protect people like her. The bright, enthusiastic young woman who had joined the Navy full of hope and patriotism was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to stay silent to survive. At her new assignment, Sarah threw herself into her work with grim determination. She performed her duties flawlessly but spoke only when absolutely necessary. She avoided social situations, declined invitations to unit gatherings, and kept her personal life completely separate from her professional one. Colleagues initially tried to include her, but her consistent silence eventually led them to give up and leave her alone. Sarah's silence was not just a refusal to engage in casual conversation. It was a form of protection, a wall she had built around herself to prevent anyone from getting close enough to hurt her again. She had learned that trust was a luxury she could not afford, and that keeping quiet was the safest way to navigate a world that had already betrayed her once. The work itself became Sarah's refuge. Communications technology was complex and demanding, requiring constant learning and adaptation. Sarah found comfort in the precision and logic of electronic systems. Unlike people, machines were predictable and honest. They either worked or they didn't, with no hidden agendas or ulterior motives. Her expertise grew rapidly as she immersed herself in increasingly complex assignments. Sarah became known as someone who could solve problems that stumped other technicians, who could work with the most sensitive equipment without making mistakes, and who could be trusted with classified information because she simply didn't talk about anything with anyone. The reputation for competence and discretion eventually brought Sarah to the attention of the Naval Special Warfare Command. They needed someone with her skills for communications support, someone who could handle top-secret information and work independently without requiring constant supervision or social interaction. Sarah's silence, which had begun as a response to trauma, had become a professional asset. At the Special Warfare Command, Sarah found herself working with some of the most elite units in the military. SEAL teams, reconnaissance units, and intelligence specialists all relied on secure communications to carry out their missions. Sarah's job was to ensure that their equipment worked perfectly and that their communications remained secure from enemy interception. The work was challenging and important, giving Sarah a sense of purpose that had been missing since the incident with Reed. She knew that her skills were directly contributing to the safety and success of warriors who put their lives on the line for their country. Even if she couldn't trust the people around her, she could at least take pride in supporting the mission. Sarah's daily routine was carefully structured to minimize unnecessary interactions. She arrived early, before most people were in the building, and stayed late after others had gone home. She ate lunch alone, usually at her desk, while working. When meetings were necessary, she participated professionally but contributed only the minimum required information. Other personnel at the base had various theories about Sarah's silence. Some thought she was naturally shy or introverted. Others assumed she was simply very serious about her job and didn't have time for small talk. A few suspected that something traumatic had happened in her past, but no one knew the details, and no one felt close enough to Sarah to ask directly. Despite her isolation, Sarah was not entirely alone. She had developed a few professional relationships with people who respected her boundaries and appreciated her competence without demanding personal conversation. These relationships were built on mutual respect and shared dedication to the mission rather than friendship or emotional connection. One of these professional relationships was with Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, a veteran communications technician who had been at the base for over 15 years. Santos had noticed Sarah's exceptional skills and quiet professionalism from the beginning. Unlike others who had given up trying to engage with Sarah socially, Santos found ways to mentor and support her without pushing for personal conversation. Santos would leave technical manuals on Sarah's desk, recommend her for challenging assignments, and provide guidance on career development through written notes and professional discussions. She never asked personal questions or tried to force Sarah into social situations, but she made it clear that she respected Sarah's work and was available if professional support was needed. Through Santos, Sarah learned about opportunities for advanced training and specialized certifications. She threw herself into these educational pursuits with the same intensity she brought to her regular duties. Each new certification and skill set made her more valuable to the organization and gave her greater job security, which was important to someone who had already experienced the arbitrary nature of military bureaucracy. Sarah's reputation for technical excellence eventually came to the attention of higher-ranking officers who were planning special operations that required the most secure and reliable communications possible. These officers cared more about capability than personality, and Sarah's combination of skills and discretion made her an ideal choice for sensitive assignments. The assignments began small, configuring equipment for short-term operations, providing technical support for training exercises, and troubleshooting communication problems that other technicians couldn't solve. Sarah performed each task flawlessly, earning trust and respect from officers who valued competence above all else. As her responsibilities grew, Sarah found herself working directly with SEAL teams and other special operations units. These warriors had their own code of silence about their missions and understood the importance of operational security. They appreciated Sarah's professional approach and never pressured her for conversation beyond what was necessary for mission success. Working with special operations personnel was different from Sarah's previous experiences in the regular Navy. These men and women were focused on their missions with an intensity that left little room for casual conversation or office politics. They treated Sarah as a valued member of the team based solely on her ability to do her job well. The respect Sarah earned from these elite units began to restore some of her confidence in her professional abilities. While she still maintained her protective silence in personal matters, she found herself able to communicate more effectively about technical and operational issues. Her expertise was valued, and her input was sought on matters related to communications security and equipment reliability. Sarah's work with special operations also exposed her to a different kind of leadership. The officers she worked with had earned their positions through demonstrated competence under extreme pressure rather than just administrative success. They were focused on mission accomplishment and the welfare of their personnel rather than personal advancement or political maneuvering. This exposure to competent, mission-focused leadership began to chip away at some of Sarah's cynicism about the military system. While she remained guarded and careful, she started to believe that there were still good leaders who cared more about doing the right thing than protecting themselves or advancing their careers. The healing process was slow and incomplete. Sarah still carried the trauma of her experience with Reed, and she still protected herself through silence and emotional distance. But her work with special operations units had shown her that not all leaders were corrupt and that her skills and dedication could make a real difference in important missions. As Sarah's reputation continued to grow within the special operations community, she began to receive requests for her services from higher and higher levels of command. Officers who had never met her personally knew her by reputation as the communications specialist who could solve any technical problem and who could be trusted with the most sensitive information. The respect she had earned was based purely on professional competence, which was exactly what Sarah needed. She didn't have to trust these people with her personal life or emotional well-being, but she could trust them to value her work and treat her fairly as long as she continued to perform at the highest level. This professional respect became a foundation for Sarah's gradual recovery from the trauma of her past. While she was still not ready to speak freely or form personal relationships, she had found a place where her silence was respected rather than questioned, where her work was valued rather than exploited, and where she could contribute to something important without having to expose herself to further harm. The stage was being set for an encounter that would test everything Sarah had learned about protecting herself while serving her country. Unknown to her, a new commander was coming to the base, someone whose reputation for integrity and directness would challenge her assumptions about military leadership and force her to confront the walls she had built around herself. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning during the weekly all-hands briefing. Admiral William Bull Harrison would be assuming command of the Naval Special Warfare Command in 2 weeks. The news rippled through the base with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Harrison was a legend in the SEAL community, a man whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. Sarah sat in the back of the briefing room, as was her custom, listening to the details about the change of command ceremony and the transition period. She paid attention to administrative details that might affect her work, but felt no particular emotion about the leadership change. In her experience, senior officers were all the same, focused on their own careers and willing to sacrifice subordinates to protect themselves. Chief Santos, sitting nearby, noticed Sarah's lack of reaction to the announcement. After the briefing, she approached Sarah's workstation with some technical manuals and a quiet observation. "Admiral Harrison is different," she said simply, placing the manuals on Sarah's desk. "You might find that interesting." Santos walked away without elaborating, leaving Sarah to wonder what she meant. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah heard increasing amounts of chatter about the incoming commander. Unlike the usual gossip that circulated when leadership changed, these conversations were filled with respect and admiration rather than complaints or cynicism. People spoke of Harrison's combat record, his integrity, and his reputation for taking care of his people. Sarah listened to these conversations with skepticism. She had heard similar things said about other officers who had later proven to be just as self-serving and corrupt as the rest. In her experience, reputation and reality rarely matched, especially when it came to senior military officers who had learned to manage their public image. The stories about Harrison seemed almost too good to be true. According to the tales circulating around the base, he had enlisted as a regular sailor before becoming an officer, had served multiple combat tours as a SEAL, and had consistently put the welfare of his troops ahead of his own advancement. People claimed he was approachable, honest, and willing to listen to anyone regardless of their rank. Sarah had heard similar stories about Lieutenant Commander Reed when she first arrived at her previous base. The other personnel had spoken of Reed with respect and admiration, describing him as a fair leader who cared about his people. Sarah's experience had taught her that public reputation was often carefully crafted to hide darker truths. As the change of command ceremony approached, Sarah made sure her work was completely up to date and that all her equipment was functioning perfectly. She had learned that leadership transitions often brought increased scrutiny and higher demands for performance. Being prepared was essential for avoiding unwanted attention. The ceremony itself was held on the base parade ground, with hundreds of personnel in dress uniforms forming precise formations under the bright morning sun. Sarah stood with her unit, maintaining the same professional composure she brought to everything else. She listened to the speeches about leadership and dedication without any real interest, focusing instead on the technical aspects of the sound system that was broadcasting the event. Admiral Harrison's speech was different from what Sarah expected. Instead of the usual platitudes about honor and duty, he spoke specifically about the importance of taking care of people and creating an environment where everyone could do their best work. He mentioned the responsibility of leadership to protect those who serve and to ensure that every person's contribution was valued and respected. Sarah found herself actually listening to the words rather than just enduring the ceremony. There was something in Harrison's tone and manner that seemed genuine, though she remained skeptical about whether his actions would match his words. She had learned not to trust speeches and promises from senior officers. After the ceremony, normal operations resumed, but Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere around the base. The new commander's guidance started filtering down through the chain of command, and it was different from what she was used to hearing. Instead of directives focused on appearance and protocol, the guidance emphasized mission effectiveness and personnel welfare. Harrison established new policies for reporting problems and concerns, creating multiple channels for personnel to communicate issues without fear of retaliation. He scheduled regular visits to different departments, not for formal inspections, but for informal discussions about what was working well and what could be improved. Sarah observed these changes with professional interest, but maintained her emotional distance. She had seen leaders make similar promises before, only to abandon them when following through became inconvenient or costly. Real change, she believed, would require more than new policies and good intentions. The first real test of Harrison's leadership came when a junior enlisted sailor reported a safety violation by a senior petty officer. In the past, such reports had often been buried or resulted in retaliation against the person making the report. Under Harrison's command, the matter was investigated quickly and thoroughly, resulting in corrective action for the safety violation and protection for the sailor who reported it. Word of this incident spread quickly through the base, and Sarah paid attention to the details. The fact that Harrison had actually followed through on his promises about protecting people who reported problems was notable, though Sarah remained cautious about drawing conclusions from a single incident. More tests followed as personnel began to take the new commander's policies seriously. A logistics specialist reported harassment from a supervisor. A maintenance technician identified a procurement process that was wasting money and reducing efficiency. A communications clerk discovered a security vulnerability in an IT system. In each case, Harrison's response was consistent. Problems were addressed quickly and effectively. People who reported issues were protected and thanked, and improvements were implemented based on suggestions from personnel at all levels. Sarah watched these developments with growing interest, though she remained skeptical about whether the pattern would continue. Harrison's approach to leadership extended beyond just responding to problems. He initiated regular walkthroughs of different departments, not as formal inspections, but as opportunities to observe operations and talk with personnel. These visits were unannounced but not disruptive, and Harrison seemed genuinely interested in understanding how things worked at the operational level. Sarah's department was scheduled for one of these visits during a particularly busy period when several SEAL teams were preparing for deployment. Communications equipment was being tested and configured around the clock, and Sarah was working long hours to ensure everything was perfect before the teams left the base. When Harrison arrived at the communications center, Sarah was deep in the process of troubleshooting a complex encryption system that was not performing to specifications. She was aware of his presence, but continued working, as the equipment problem was critical to mission success, and could not wait for social pleasantries. Harrison observed the various technicians at work, asking questions about their equipment and procedures. Sarah could hear him moving through the workspace, but she remained focused on her troubleshooting. She had identified the problem as a software configuration issue that required careful attention to detail to resolve correctly. Chief Santos approached Harrison and began explaining the different systems and their functions. Sarah could hear their conversation in the background, but remained concentrated on her work. The encryption system was finally responding correctly to her adjustments, and she needed to complete the configuration while everything was working properly. As Sarah worked, she was vaguely aware that the conversation between Harrison and Santos had moved closer to her workstation. They were discussing the complexity of modern communications security and the skills required to maintain such sophisticated equipment. Sarah continued working, making final adjustments to ensure the system would perform reliably under operational conditions. Suddenly, Harrison's voice was much closer, and Sarah realized he was standing directly behind her workstation. "This is Petty Officer Martinez," Santos was saying. "She's our specialist for the most complex communication systems. Her work supports some of our most sensitive operations." Sarah completed her configuration sequence and began the final system checks. The encryption system was now functioning perfectly, ready to provide secure communications for the deploying SEAL teams. She turned around to find Admiral Harrison standing just a few feet away, watching her work with obvious interest. "Petty Officer Martinez," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of command, but also a note of genuine curiosity. "Chief Santos tells me you're the go-to person for solving impossible technical problems. I'd like to understand more about what you do here." Sarah nodded politely, but said nothing beyond, "Yes, sir." She had learned that saying too much to senior officers was dangerous, and she maintained her policy of minimal communication even with the new commander. Harrison waited for a moment, as if expecting her to elaborate, but Sarah remained silent. Harrison looked at the equipment Sarah had been working on, noting the complexity of the displays and controls. "This looks like sophisticated gear," he observed. "How long does it typically take to resolve a configuration problem like the one you just fixed?" "It depends on the nature of the problem, sir," Sarah replied, keeping her answer brief and technical. She avoided eye contact and focused on checking her final system readings. The encryption system was performing perfectly now, ready for operational use. Harrison seemed to sense Sarah's discomfort with the conversation, but continued with his questions. "Chief Santos mentioned that you work with our most sensitive systems. That must require extensive training and security clearances." "Yes, sir," Sarah confirmed, still keeping her responses minimal. She began organizing her tools and documentation, hoping to signal that she needed to return to her work. There were other systems that required attention before the SEAL teams departed. Instead of taking the hint and moving on, Harrison pulled up a nearby chair and sat down at Sarah's eye level. This unexpected action got Sarah's attention, as senior officers typically remained standing during such interactions, using their physical position to emphasize their authority. "Petty Officer Martinez," Harrison said quietly, "I get the impression that you're not comfortable talking with me. Is there something about this conversation that's bothering you?" Sarah was taken aback by the direct question. Most officers would have simply accepted her minimal responses and moved on to someone more talkative. Harrison's willingness to address the obvious tension was unexpected and made her uncertain about how to respond. "No, sir, nothing's bothering me," Sarah replied, though her body language clearly indicated otherwise. She remained focused on her equipment, avoiding eye contact with Harrison. "I'm just focused on completing my work." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate dedication to duty," he said. "But I also believe that communication is important, especially when we're dealing with complex operations that depend on everyone working together effectively." Sarah felt trapped by the conversation. She couldn't simply walk away from a senior officer, but She also couldn't bring herself to engage in the kind of open discussion Harrison seemed to want. Her protective silence had become such an ingrained habit that breaking it felt dangerous, even with someone who seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. Harrison seemed to recognize Sarah's dilemma. Instead of pressing for more personal conversation, he shifted to technical questions about the communication systems. "Tell me about this encryption system," he said. "What makes it so critical for our operations?" Sarah found that she could answer technical questions more easily than personal ones. She began explaining the capabilities and importance of the encryption system, describing how it protected sensitive communications from enemy interception. As she talked about her work, some of her tension began to ease. Harrison listened attentively, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine understanding of the technical challenges involved. His questions were informed and thoughtful, showing that he had enough technical background to appreciate the complexity of Sarah's work. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself engaged in a real conversation about her expertise. Harrison's questions encouraged her to explain not just what she did, but why it mattered and how it contributed to mission success. She began to speak more freely, though she still maintained her professional demeanor. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Harrison asking about different aspects of communication security and Sarah providing detailed explanations. Other personnel in the workspace began to take notice, as this was the longest conversation anyone had heard Sarah engage in since she arrived at the base. As the discussion progressed, Sarah realized that Harrison's questions were not just casual curiosity. He was systematically gathering information about communications capabilities, challenges, and needs. His questions revealed a deeper understanding of operational requirements than most senior officers possessed. Finally, Harrison stood up and prepared to move on to other areas of the communications center. "Thank you for taking the time to explain all of this, Petty Officer Martinez," he said. "Your expertise is clearly crucial to our mission success. I hope we can continue this conversation in the future." Sarah nodded politely and returned to her work, but she found it difficult to concentrate. The conversation with Harrison had been unlike anything she had experienced with a senior officer. He had shown genuine interest in her work and had treated her as a valuable contributor rather than just another subordinate to be managed. Over the following days, Sarah found herself thinking about the encounter with Harrison. She had expected him to be like all the other senior officers she had dealt with, focused on appearances and quick to move on when faced with someone who wasn't eager to engage socially. Instead, he had taken the time to understand her work and had shown respect for her expertise. Chief Santos noticed that Sarah seemed somewhat preoccupied after Harrison's visit. During a quiet moment, she approached Sarah's workstation with a knowing smile. "Admiral Harrison has that effect on people," she observed. "He actually listens to what you have to say." Sarah looked up from her work, considering Santos's comment. "He asked a lot of technical questions," she admitted. "More detailed than most officers bother with." Santos nodded. "He does his homework. Before he asks you about your job, he makes sure he understands enough to ask intelligent questions. It's part of what makes people trust him." The word trust made Sarah uncomfortable. She had learned not to trust anyone, especially senior officers who had the power to make her life difficult. But she couldn't deny that Harrison had treated her differently than she expected. As the days passed, Sarah heard more stories about Harrison's leadership style. Unlike other commanders who relied on formal briefings and written reports, Harrison made it a point to talk directly with people at all levels of the organization. He was building a comprehensive understanding of operations based on first-hand conversations with the people who actually did the work. Sarah learned that Harrison had served as an enlisted sailor early in his career, which explained his understanding of how things worked at the operational level. He had earned his commission through hard work and demonstrated competence rather than just education and connections. This background made him different from many officers who had never experienced military service from the enlisted perspective. The more Sarah learned about Harrison, the more her skepticism began to waver. She had spent years protecting herself by assuming the worst about people in authority, but Harrison's actions seemed to contradict her expectations at every turn. He was proving to be exactly what his reputation suggested, a leader who actually cared about his people and followed through on his commitments. Sarah's internal struggle between skepticism and hope was interrupted by a crisis that would test Harrison's leadership in ways no one could have predicted. A training exercise had gone wrong, resulting in serious injuries to several SEAL team members. The incident required immediate investigation and response, and it would reveal whether Harrison's promises about protecting people and seeking truth were genuine or just empty words designed to build popularity. The emergency alarm echoed through the base at 0347 hours on a Thursday morning, pulling Sarah from a deep sleep in her barracks room. Training exercises were common, but emergency calls in the middle of the night usually meant something had gone seriously wrong. Sarah quickly dressed and made her way to the communications center, where she found the overnight staff frantically coordinating rescue and medical response efforts. A routine nighttime training exercise had turned into a disaster when a navigation system malfunction caused a helicopter carrying 8 SEAL team members to crash into the ocean 15 miles offshore. The helicopter pilot had managed to send a brief distress signal before impact, but communications had been lost immediately afterward. Search and rescue operations were already underway, but the darkness and rough seas were making the effort extremely difficult. Sarah immediately began checking all communications equipment to ensure search and rescue teams had the best possible connectivity. She worked methodically through emergency protocols, testing backup systems, and verifying that all frequencies were clear for rescue operations. The equipment was functioning perfectly, but Sarah knew that technical reliability would be crucial during the long hours ahead. Admiral Harrison arrived at the command center within 20 minutes of the initial alarm. Unlike many senior officers who would have remained in their quarters and waited for updates, Harrison came directly to where operations were being coordinated. Sarah observed him as he moved through the center, gathering information from different personnel and getting a complete picture of the situation. Harrison's approach to the crisis was systematic and calm. He asked specific questions about search parameters, weather conditions, and available resources. He spoke with the search and rescue coordinators, the medical personnel standing by to treat casualties, and the maintenance crews ensuring that all equipment remained operational throughout the night. Sarah watched Harrison's leadership during the crisis with professional interest. Unlike the panic and confusion she had seen from other senior officers during previous emergencies, Harrison maintained a steady focus on the mission while showing genuine concern for the people involved. He made decisions quickly, but only after gathering all available information. The search continued through the night and into the following day. 3 of the SEAL team members were recovered alive, but injured, pulled from life rafts that had deployed automatically when the helicopter hit the water. 2 others were found deceased, their bodies recovered by search teams working in increasingly dangerous conditions. 3 team members remained missing, and the helicopter wreckage had not yet been located. As the search entered its second day, Harrison made a decision that surprised many people on the base. Instead of delegating the investigation to subordinate officers, as was typical for incidents of this magnitude, he announced that he would personally lead the investigation into the cause of the crash. This was unusual for an admiral, but Harrison explained that he needed to understand exactly what had happened to prevent future tragedies. Sarah learned about Harrison's decision to lead the investigation personally when Chief Santos mentioned it during a brief conversation about communications support for the ongoing search operations. Santos seemed unsurprised by Harrison's choice, noting that he had a reputation for taking personal responsibility for everything that happened under his command. The investigation began immediately, even as search operations continued for the 3 missing SEAL team members. Harrison assembled a team of experts from different disciplines: aviation maintenance, navigation systems, weather analysis, and operations planning. Unlike typical military investigations that often focused on assigning blame, this investigation seemed focused on understanding the truth about what had gone wrong. Sarah became involved in the investigation when Harrison requested detailed analysis of all communications related to the training exercise. As the base's expert on communication systems, Sarah was asked to review radio transmissions, navigation data, and emergency signals to determine whether equipment failures had contributed to the crash. Working with the investigation team was different from Sarah's usual solitary assignments. The team members were focused on finding facts rather than protecting careers or avoiding responsibility. Harrison had made it clear that he wanted complete honesty in the investigation, regardless of what the findings might reveal about procedures, equipment, or personnel decisions. Sarah found herself working closely with the aviation maintenance specialists, who were analyzing the helicopter's technical systems. The navigation equipment that had apparently malfunctioned was integrated with communications systems that Sarah understood better than anyone else on the team. Her expertise was crucial for determining whether the malfunction was caused by equipment failure or human error. As Sarah delved deeper into the technical analysis, she discovered troubling evidence that the navigation system malfunction might have been preventable. Maintenance records showed that the helicopter's navigation equipment had been experiencing intermittent problems for several weeks, but these issues had been classified as minor and routine repairs had been repeatedly postponed. The maintenance delays were not caused by lazy or incompetent personnel. Sarah's investigation revealed a more complex problem involving resource allocation, work prioritization, and risk assessment. The base maintenance department was understaffed and overworked, forced to make difficult decisions about which repairs to prioritize when they couldn't keep up with all the required work. Sarah's findings put her in a difficult position. The evidence suggested that the crash might have been prevented if the navigation system repairs had been prioritized differently. However, pointing this out would implicate several people in the maintenance chain of command, including officers who might retaliate against her for revealing their mistakes. Sarah's past experience with Lieutenant Commander Reed had taught her that revealing inconvenient truths could be dangerous for the person making the revelations. She had learned that senior officers often protected themselves by attacking the credibility of subordinates who brought them bad news. Despite Admiral Harrison's promises about protecting people who told the truth, Sarah remained skeptical about whether those promises would hold when the stakes were high. For 3 days, Sarah struggled with what to do with her findings. She could present her analysis honestly and risk retaliation, or she could soften her conclusions to avoid creating problems for the people involved. Her natural instinct was to protect herself by minimizing the implications of her discoveries. The decision became more urgent when Harrison scheduled a preliminary briefing on the investigation findings. Sarah would be required to present her communications and technical analysis to a room full of senior officers, including those who might be implicated by her findings. The briefing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving Sarah the weekend to prepare her presentation. Sarah spent the weekend reviewing her evidence multiple times, looking for ways to present the information without directly accusing anyone of negligence or poor judgment. She tried to find technical explanations that would minimize human responsibility for the maintenance delays. But every analysis led to the same conclusion. The crash had been preventable if proper priorities had been established for equipment maintenance. By Sunday evening, Sarah faced a choice that would define her future relationship with the truth and with her own integrity. She could present her findings honestly, despite the risk of retaliation, or she could compromise her analysis to protect herself and others from uncomfortable consequences. Chief Santos found Sarah in the communications center late Sunday night, working alone on her presentation materials. Santos had noticed Sarah's distress over the past few days and had come to check on her welfare. Without being asked, Santos sat down nearby and waited for Sarah to explain what was troubling her. Sarah found herself talking more openly with Santos than she had with anyone in years. She explained her findings about the maintenance delays and her concerns about presenting information that would reflect badly on several officers. Sarah described her previous experience with Lieutenant Commander Reed and her fear that telling the truth would lead to retaliation against her. Santos listened without interrupting, allowing Sarah to express her concerns fully before responding. When Sarah finished, Santos was quiet for a moment, considering how to respond to such a difficult situation. Finally, she spoke with the voice of someone who had seen many years of military service and understood the challenges faced by people in Sarah's position. "I've been watching Admiral Harrison for the past few months," Santos said quietly. "I've seen him handle difficult situations before, and I've never seen him punish someone for telling the truth. But I understand why you're scared. What happened to you before would make anyone cautious about trusting authority figures." Sarah appreciated Santos's understanding, but remained uncertain about what to do. Santos continued, "The question you have to ask yourself is whether you're going to let what Reed did to you control the rest of your career. Are you going to let his abuse prevent you from doing what you know is right?" The conversation with Santos forced Sarah to confront the broader implications of her situation. She had spent years protecting herself through silence and avoidance, but this approach was now preventing her from fulfilling her professional responsibilities. Her expertise had uncovered important safety information, and hiding that information could lead to future accidents. Sarah realized that her silence had evolved from a protective mechanism into something that might actually harm the people she was supposed to support. SEAL teams depended on reliable equipment for their survival, and maintenance problems that weren't addressed could cost lives in future operations. Her technical analysis could help prevent future tragedies, but only if she was willing to speak up. The decision to present her findings honestly required Sarah to overcome years of conditioning that had taught her to stay quiet to avoid retaliation. She would have to trust that Admiral Harrison was different from Lieutenant Commander Reed, despite her painful experience with trusting authority figures in the past. Monday morning arrived with Sarah still uncertain about her decision, but committed to preparing an honest presentation of her findings. She organized her technical analysis clearly, documenting the evidence trail that led to her conclusions about preventable maintenance issues. If she was going to speak up, she would do it professionally and with complete documentation. The briefing room was filled with senior officers from different departments, all waiting to hear the preliminary findings from the crash investigation. Sarah sat with the other technical experts, watching Admiral Harrison as he prepared to begin the meeting. His demeanor was serious but calm, focused on understanding the facts rather than managing political implications. Harrison began the briefing by emphasizing the importance of complete honesty in the investigation. He stated clearly that he was more interested in preventing future accidents than in protecting anyone's reputation or career. He promised that people who provided truthful information would be protected, regardless of what that information might reveal about policies or decisions. Sarah listened to Harrison's opening statements with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She had heard similar promises before, but she noticed that Harrison's tone and manner seemed more genuine than the political speeches she was used to hearing from senior officers. Still, she remained cautious about trusting his words until she saw how he responded to actual uncomfortable information. The briefing proceeded through different aspects of the investigation, with experts presenting their findings on weather conditions, aircraft maintenance, operational procedures, and personnel qualifications. Each presentation was thorough and professional, focusing on facts rather than opinions or blame assignment. When Sarah's turn came to present her communications and technical analysis, she found herself standing before a room full of senior officers, many of whom would be affected by her findings. This was the moment when she would have to choose between self-protection and professional integrity, between the safety of silence and the risk of speaking truth to power. Sarah looked at Admiral Harrison, who was waiting attentively for her presentation. His expression was serious but encouraging, showing no sign of impatience or prejudgment. For the first time in years, Sarah felt that she was looking at a leader who actually wanted to hear what she had to say, regardless of how uncomfortable it might be. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began her presentation with the technical details of the communication systems involved in the training exercise. She explained the integration between navigation and communications equipment, setting the foundation for the more difficult conclusions that would follow. As she spoke, she noticed that Harrison and the other officers were paying close attention to her analysis, asking clarifying questions that showed they were taking her expertise seriously. When Sarah reached the critical part of her presentation about the maintenance delays and their relationship to the navigation system failure, she paused for a moment before continuing. This was the point where her honesty would be tested, where she would have to trust that Admiral Harrison's promises about protection and truth-telling were more than just empty words. Looking directly at Harrison, Sarah presented her findings about the preventable nature of the equipment malfunction. She documented the maintenance delays, explained the risk assessment failures, and outlined how different prioritization decisions might have prevented the crash. Her presentation was factual and professional, but the implications were clear. People had made decisions that contributed to the tragedy. The silence in the briefing room after Sarah's presentation was heavy and uncomfortable. Senior officers shifted in their chairs, some looking down at their notes, others exchanging glances with their colleagues. Sarah had just presented evidence that could end careers and result in formal disciplinary action against several people in the chain of command. The implications of her findings were serious enough to affect everyone present. Admiral Harrison studied the technical documentation Sarah had provided, taking time to review the maintenance records and timeline analysis that supported her conclusions. Unlike other senior officers who might have immediately begun damage control or questioned the messenger's credibility, Harrison focused on understanding the details of Sarah's analysis. Petty Officer Martinez, Harrison said finally, his voice carrying the weight of command but also a note of appreciation. This is thorough and professional work. Your analysis clearly shows a pattern of maintenance deferrals that contributed to this tragedy. Can you explain your assessment of how these delays were prioritized? Sarah felt a moment of relief that Harrison was focusing on the technical aspects of her findings rather than questioning her motives or qualifications. She explained the resource allocation process that had led to the navigation system repairs being repeatedly postponed in favor of what appeared to be more urgent maintenance needs. As Sarah provided more details about the maintenance prioritization system, it became clear that the problem was more complex than simple negligence or incompetence. The maintenance department was operating under resource constraints that forced difficult choices between competing priorities. Equipment was failing faster than it could be repaired, creating a backlog that made some level of risk inevitable. Harrison's questions revealed that he understood the broader systemic issues that had contributed to the maintenance delays. Rather than looking for someone to blame, he was trying to understand how the system could be improved to prevent similar tragedies in the future. His approach to the problem was solution-focused rather than punishment-focused. Other officers in the briefing room began to contribute their perspectives on the resource and prioritization challenges. Instead of defensive responses or attempts to shift blame, the discussion became collaborative, with people sharing information about constraints and pressures that affected their decision-making processes. Sarah watched this discussion with amazement. She had expected her presentation to trigger defensive reactions and attacks on her credibility. Instead, Harrison had created an environment where people felt safe to acknowledge problems and contribute to solutions. This was completely different from her previous experience with military leadership. The briefing continued for another hour, with detailed discussion of maintenance procedures, resource allocation, and risk assessment protocols. Harrison asked probing questions but maintained a focus on understanding and improvement rather than fault-finding. By the end of the meeting, several specific recommendations had emerged for preventing similar incidents in the future. As the briefing concluded, Harrison thanked each presenter for their contributions to the investigation. When he addressed Sarah specifically, he emphasized the importance of her technical analysis and the courage required to present difficult findings honestly. His recognition was public and unambiguous, making it clear that he valued truth-telling even when it revealed uncomfortable realities. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her workstation feeling emotionally drained but also strangely relieved. She had spoken truthfully about serious problems and had been received with respect rather than retaliation. For the first time in years, she had experienced leadership that actually lived up to its promises about protecting people who told the truth. Chief Santos approached Sarah's workstation later that afternoon with a knowing smile. "How do you feel about Admiral Harrison's leadership style now?" she asked quietly. "Still think all senior officers are the same?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "He handled the briefing differently than I expected," she admitted. "But it's too early to know if this will continue when the stakes get higher." Santos nodded understandingly. "Trust has to be earned over time," she said. "But you've seen him handle a real crisis with real consequences. That should tell you something about his character." Over the following days, Sarah observed how Harrison followed through on the commitments he had made during the investigation briefing. New resources were allocated to the maintenance department, risk assessment procedures were revised, and training programs were implemented to prevent similar prioritization failures. Most importantly, no one involved in the maintenance delays faced retaliation or career damage. The investigation's final report was comprehensive and honest, documenting not only the immediate causes of the crash, but also the systemic issues that had contributed to the maintenance problems. Harrison took personal responsibility for the command failures while also recommending changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Sarah's technical analysis became a crucial component of the final report, and her recommendations for improved integration between communications and navigation systems were adopted as standard procedures. Her expertise had directly contributed to safety improvements that would protect future SEAL operations. The recognition of Sarah's contributions extended beyond just the investigation report. Harrison mentioned her work in his monthly command briefing, highlighting how technical expertise at all levels was crucial for mission success and personnel safety. This public recognition was something Sarah had never experienced before, acknowledgement based on competence rather than personal relationships or political considerations. As weeks passed, Sarah found herself gradually becoming more willing to engage in professional discussions beyond the absolute minimum required for her duties. She began participating more actively in technical meetings and offering suggestions for equipment improvements and procedural changes. Her expertise was valued, and her input was sought on increasingly complex projects. The change in Sarah's communication style was gradual, but noticeable to those who worked with her regularly. She remained quiet and professional in social situations, but she became more willing to share her knowledge and opinions on technical matters. The protective silence that had defined her for years was slowly giving way to professional engagement. Harrison's leadership style continued to demonstrate consistency over time. He made decisions based on facts rather than politics, supported personnel who told the truth even when it was uncomfortable, and took responsibility for problems while working to solve them rather than hide them. His actions consistently matched his words, building trust throughout the organization. Sarah's growing respect for Harrison's leadership created an internal conflict with her long-standing policy of emotional detachment from authority figures. She found herself wanting to trust him while simultaneously fighting against that impulse based on her previous traumatic experience. The healing process was slow and uncertain, complicated by years of protective conditioning. The conflict intensified when Harrison announced new initiatives designed to improve communication and trust throughout the command. He established regular forums for personnel to raise concerns without going through formal channels, created mentorship programs to help junior personnel develop their careers, and implemented recognition programs that rewarded honesty and initiative rather than just compliance. Sarah observed these initiatives with professional interest but remained cautious about participating personally. She could see that Harrison was creating positive changes throughout the organization, but her own involvement remained limited to her technical responsibilities. The barriers she had built around herself were proving difficult to lower, even in the face of trustworthy leadership. The situation came to a head during a major exercise involving multiple SEAL teams and complex communications requirements. Sarah was assigned as the lead communications specialist for the exercise, responsible for ensuring reliable connectivity for all participating units. The assignment required her to work directly with team leaders and coordinate with multiple support personnel. During the exercise planning phase, Sarah encountered a significant problem with the proposed communications architecture. The plan called for using frequency ranges that would conflict with each other under certain atmospheric conditions, potentially causing communication failures during critical phases of the operation. The problem was serious enough to compromise mission success and personnel safety. Sarah identified the problem during her technical review of the exercise plan, but addressing it would require challenging the decisions made by senior communications officers who had approved the original design. The frequency allocation plan had been developed by officers with more rank and experience than Sarah, and questioning their expertise could be seen as insubordination or arrogance. The situation was complicated by the fact that the exercise was scheduled to begin in just 3 days, leaving little time for major changes to the communications plan. Raising concerns at this late stage would force a complete redesign of the communications architecture and could delay the entire exercise. The political pressure to remain silent and hope for the best was enormous. Sarah found herself facing the same type of decision she had confronted during the crash investigation, but with even higher stakes. The exercise involved hundreds of personnel and millions of dollars in equipment. If the communications failures she predicted actually occurred, the consequences could be severe for both mission success and personnel safety. After struggling with the decision overnight, Sarah decided to present her concerns directly to Admiral Harrison. She prepared a detailed technical analysis showing the frequency conflicts and their potential impact on communications reliability. Her analysis included specific recommendations for resolving the problems, along with a revised timeline that would allow the exercise to proceed safely. Sarah requested a meeting with Harrison through proper channels, explaining that she had identified critical technical issues with the exercise communications plan. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning, giving Sarah time to refine her presentation and prepare for what could be a career-defining conversation. When Sarah entered Harrison's office, she found him reviewing exercise plans and coordinating with his staff on final preparations. Despite the obvious pressure he was under, Harrison gave Sarah his complete attention and asked her to explain her concerns in detail. Sarah presented her technical analysis systematically, showing the frequency conflict data and explaining how atmospheric conditions during the exercise timeframe would create communication dead zones at critical moments. Her presentation was thorough and professional, but she could see that the implications were serious enough to require major changes to carefully laid plans. Harrison studied Sarah's analysis carefully, asking detailed questions about the technical aspects and potential solutions. Unlike other officers who might have dismissed concerns from a junior enlisted person or focused on the political implications of making last-minute changes, Harrison concentrated on understanding the technical issues and their operational impact. Petty Officer Martinez, Harrison said after reviewing all the technical data. If your analysis is correct, proceeding with the current communications plan could put people at risk. That's unacceptable, regardless of the inconvenience of making changes at this stage. Sarah felt a surge of relief that Harrison was taking her concerns seriously, but she also recognized that implementing her recommendations would create significant challenges for the entire exercise planning team. The frequency allocation changes would require coordination with multiple agencies and could affect other operations beyond just the SEAL exercise. Harrison immediately called a meeting with the exercise planning staff and communications officers to review Sarah's findings. Sarah found herself presenting her analysis to the same group of senior officers whose work she was essentially criticizing. The situation could have been humiliating or career-damaging if Harrison had not made it clear that he supported Sarah's technical assessment. Instead of defensive reactions, the meeting resulted in collaborative problem-solving as the planning team worked together to implement Sarah's recommendations. Harrison's leadership set the tone for the discussion, emphasizing mission success and personnel safety over pride or convenience. The exercise was delayed by 2 days to allow for proper implementation of the communications changes. The exercise itself was a complete success, with communications functioning flawlessly throughout all phases of the operation. Sarah's predictions about frequency conflicts proved accurate, and the changes she had recommended prevented what would have been serious communication failures during critical mission phases. Harrison made a point of recognizing Sarah's contributions during the exercise debrief, highlighting how her technical expertise and willingness to speak up had prevented serious problems. His recognition was specific and public, making it clear that challenging flawed plans was not only acceptable but essential for mission success. The exercise experience marked a turning point in Sarah's relationship with military leadership and her own professional identity. She had successfully challenged senior officers' decisions and had been supported rather than punished for doing so. Her expertise had been valued, her integrity had been respected, and her contributions had made a real difference in mission outcomes. For the first time since her experience with Lieutenant Commander Reed, Sarah began to believe that she could trust military leadership to do the right thing when presented with facts and honest analysis. Harrison's consistent support for truth-telling had created an environment where Sarah could contribute her full capabilities without fear of retaliation. The change in Sarah's professional engagement was noticeable throughout the communications department. She became more proactive in identifying problems and proposing solutions, more willing to collaborate with colleagues on complex projects, and more confident in sharing her expertise with others. While she remained quiet in social situations, her professional voice had been restored. Chief Santos observed Sarah's transformation with satisfaction, noting that the young woman's technical brilliance was finally being matched by the confidence to use it effectively. Admiral Harrison has given you something important, Santos told Sarah during one of their conversations. He's given you permission to be excellent at your job. Sarah's renewed professional confidence would soon be tested in ways she could never have imagined. Unknown to her, Admiral Harrison was planning a major reorganization of the communications department, and her demonstrated expertise and integrity had brought her to his attention for a role that would challenge everything she thought she knew about leadership and responsibility. 6 months after the communications exercise, Admiral Harrison called a special meeting of all department heads and senior personnel. Sarah attended as the representative for advanced communications systems, a role she had gradually assumed as her expertise became recognized throughout the command. She sat in the back of the conference room, as was her custom, prepared to take notes and provide technical input if needed. Harrison began the meeting by discussing changes in operational requirements and emerging threats that demanded new approaches to communications security and reliability. The nature of SEAL operations was evolving, requiring more sophisticated technology and better integration between different systems. The current organizational structure was not adequately meeting these challenges. As Harrison outlined his vision for reorganizing the communications department, Sarah listened with professional interest. The proposed changes would create new specialized teams, establish clearer responsibility chains, and implement advanced training programs. The reorganization made sense from a technical perspective, addressing many of the systemic issues Sarah had observed during her years at the base. Harrison explained that the reorganization would require promoting several personnel to new leadership positions, including some individuals who had not previously held supervisory roles. He emphasized that these promotions would be based on demonstrated competence and integrity rather than just seniority or administrative experience. Sarah assumed that the leadership positions would go to senior petty officers and junior officers who had been at the base longer than she had. While she was interested in the technical aspects of the reorganization, she didn't expect it to affect her personally beyond possibly changing her reporting structure or duty assignments. Harrison continued his presentation by describing specific leadership roles that would be created within the reorganized communications department. Each position required deep technical knowledge, proven problem-solving ability, and the integrity to make difficult decisions under pressure. The responsibilities would include both technical oversight and personnel management. As Harrison described the qualifications for these new leadership positions, Sarah began to realize that her recent experiences, the crash investigation, the exercise communications planning, and her various technical achievements, had positioned her as a candidate for promotion. The thought was both exciting and terrifying, as it would mean stepping into a visible leadership role that would require her to overcome her protective silence. Harrison's presentation concluded with an announcement that surprised everyone in the room. Instead of simply announcing the new organizational structure, he was going to personally interview candidates for the leadership positions. This was unusual for promotions at this level, but Harrison explained that the success of the reorganization depended on selecting the right people for these critical roles. After the meeting, Sarah returned to her workstation with mixed feelings about the upcoming changes. Part of her was excited about the possibility of taking on greater responsibility and contributing more directly to important missions. Another part of her was frightened by the prospect of increased visibility and the potential for conflict with other personnel who might resent her rapid advancement. Chief Santos approached Sarah later that day with news that she had been selected as a candidate for one of the new leadership positions. Santos explained that Harrison had specifically requested that Sarah be interviewed for the role of Communications Systems Integration Leader, a position that would involve coordinating between different technical teams and ensuring reliable communications for special operations. Sarah was stunned by the news. She had never actively sought promotion or leadership responsibilities, having focused instead on technical excellence and staying out of administrative complications. The thought of being responsible for other people's work and welfare brought back memories of how vulnerable she had felt when Lieutenant Commander Reed had abused his authority over her. Santos seemed to understand Sarah's conflicted reaction to the promotion opportunity. Leadership isn't just about having authority over other people, she explained. It's about using your expertise and integrity to help others succeed and to accomplish important missions. You've already been doing that informally. This would just make it official. Sarah spent the weekend thinking about the promotion opportunity and what it would mean for her carefully constructed life of technical competence and emotional detachment. Taking a leadership position would require her to communicate more openly, make decisions that affected other people, and trust that the system would support her when difficult choices were necessary. The interview with Admiral Harrison was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Sarah prepared by reviewing her technical achievements and thinking about how she would handle the responsibilities of a leadership position. But she also struggled with deeper questions about whether she was ready to trust the military system enough to accept a position of authority within it. When Tuesday arrived, Sarah found herself sitting outside Harrison's office, waiting for her interview with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She had prepared thoroughly for technical questions, but she was uncertain about how to present herself as a potential leader when her entire professional identity had been built around staying in the background. Harrison's aide called Sarah into the office at precisely 1,400 hours. She entered to find Harrison sitting at his desk, reviewing what appeared to be her personnel file and performance evaluations. He gestured for her to take a seat across from his desk and looked up with the same serious but encouraging expression she had come to associate with him. Petty Officer Martinez, Harrison began, I've been watching your work for the past several months, and I've been impressed by your technical expertise and your professional integrity. I'm considering you for a leadership position that would put you in charge of some of our most critical communications systems. I'd like to understand how you feel about taking on that level of responsibility. Sarah had rehearsed her answer to this question, but, sitting across from Harrison, she found herself responding more honestly than she had planned. Sir, I take my technical responsibilities seriously, and I understand the importance of reliable communications for mission success. I'm confident in my ability to handle the technical aspects of the position. Harrison nodded, but pressed for more detail. Technical competence is essential, but this position would also require you to supervise other personnel, coordinate between different departments, and make decisions that affect operational readiness. Those responsibilities go beyond just technical knowledge. How do you feel about those aspects of leadership? The question forced Sarah to confront her fears about authority and responsibility directly. She had been thinking about the technical challenges of the new position, but she had been avoiding consideration of the interpersonal aspects that would be equally important. "Sir, I've had some difficult experiences with military leadership in the past," Sarah said carefully. "I've learned to be cautious about trusting people with authority, and I've been reluctant to seek authority myself because I've seen how it can be abused." Harrison leaned forward slightly, his expression showing genuine interest in Sarah's response. "Can you tell me more about those experiences? I need to understand what concerns you about taking on leadership responsibilities." Sarah found herself in an impossible position. She wanted to be honest with Harrison about her past experience with Lieutenant Commander Reed, but she had never spoken about the incident with anyone in authority. The fear of retaliation and the shame of what had happened had kept her silent for years. Harrison seemed to sense Sarah's internal struggle. "Petty Officer Martinez, I can see that this is difficult for you to talk about. If you've experienced abuse or harassment in the past, I want you to know that I take such matters seriously, and I won't allow retaliation against people who report problems." The invitation to speak honestly about her past created a moment of decision for Sarah. She could continue to protect herself through silence, or she could trust Harrison with the truth about what had shaped her professional behavior for the past 4 years. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to tell Harrison about her experience with Lieutenant Commander Reed. She described the harassment, the abuse of authority, the failed attempts to report the problem, and the retaliation that had followed when she tried to seek help. Her voice remained steady and professional, but the emotion behind her words was unmistakable. Harrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly serious as Sarah described the pattern of abuse and institutional failure she had experienced. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what she had shared. "Petty Officer Martinez," Harrison said finally, "I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sorry that the system failed to protect you when you tried to do the right thing. What Reed did was criminal, and the failure to investigate your complaints was inexcusable." Sarah felt a surge of relief at hearing her experience validated by someone in authority. For years, she had wondered whether she had somehow misunderstood the situation or whether she was overreacting to Reed's behavior. Harrison's unambiguous condemnation of Reed's actions confirmed that her assessment had been correct. Harrison continued, "I understand now why you've been cautious about trusting leadership, and why the prospect of taking on authority yourself would be difficult. But I want you to consider something. Your experience with abuse has given you insights that could make you a better leader, not a worse one." Sarah was surprised by this perspective. She had seen her traumatic experience as something that disqualified her from leadership rather than something that might enhance her capabilities. Harrison's interpretation challenged her assumptions about how past trauma related to future responsibilities. "You know what it feels like to be vulnerable to someone with authority," Harrison explained. "You understand the importance of protecting people who report problems, and you've seen how institutional failures can destroy trust. Those insights could help you create the kind of leadership environment that protects rather than exploits the people under your command." Sarah considered Harrison's words carefully. She had spent years focusing on how her experience with Reed had damaged her ability to trust others, but she had never thought about how it might have developed her understanding of leadership responsibility. Harrison leaned back in his chair and looked at Sarah directly. "I'm going to ask you something that might seem strange given what you've just told me. I want you to consider accepting the leadership position not despite your past experience, but because of it. I think you could help ensure that other people never experience what you went through." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Harrison asking detailed questions about Sarah's vision for the communications department and her ideas for improving both technical capabilities and personnel management. Sarah found herself engaging more openly than she had in years, discussing her observations about systemic problems and her ideas for solutions. As the interview concluded, Harrison made an unexpected request. "Petty Officer Martinez, before you give me your final answer about the promotion, I want you to think about something. You've spent the past few years proving that you can excel despite difficult circumstances. Now I'm asking you to consider whether you're ready to help create better circumstances for others." Sarah left Harrison's office with a decision to make that would define the next phase of her career and possibly her life. The promotion opportunity represented both a professional advancement and a personal challenge that would require her to move beyond the protective silence she had maintained for so long. Over the next week, Sarah found herself engaging in more conversations with colleagues than she had initiated in years. She asked Chief Santos and other trusted personnel about their experiences with leadership and their observations about what made effective supervision. She was surprised to discover how many people were willing to share their insights and support her development. The decision-making process forced Sarah to confront fundamental questions about her relationship with the military and her own sense of purpose. She had joined the Navy with idealistic goals about serving her country, but her experience with Reed had shattered those ideals and left her focused solely on survival and technical competence. Harrison's leadership had begun to restore Sarah's faith in the possibility of ethical military service, but accepting a leadership position would require her to fully embrace that faith and commit to being part of the solution rather than just protecting herself from the problems. After a week of reflection and consultation with people she trusted, Sarah made her decision. She requested another meeting with Admiral Harrison to give him her answer about the promotion opportunity. When Sarah entered Harrison's office for the second time, she carried herself with a confidence that had been absent from their previous meeting. She had made her choice not just about the job opportunity, but about the kind of person and leader she wanted to become. "Admiral Harrison," Sarah said, looking directly at him with steady eye contact, "I've decided to accept the leadership position. I want to use my experience and expertise to help create the kind of communications department that supports the mission while protecting the people who serve." Harrison smiled with genuine satisfaction. "Outstanding, Petty Officer Martinez. I was hoping you would make that decision. Now, there's something I need to tell you about the promotion process." Sarah waited expectantly, assuming that Harrison would explain administrative details about the transition to her new role. Instead, he stood up and walked around his desk to face her directly. "Petty Officer Martinez," Harrison said, his voice carrying the formal tone of command. "By the authority vested in me by the United States Navy, I hereby promote you to the rank of Chief Petty Officer, effective immediately." Sarah was stunned. She had expected the promotion to involve a lengthy administrative process and formal ceremony. Instead, Harrison was promoting her on the spot, acknowledging her contributions with immediate recognition of her new rank and responsibilities. Harrison continued, "Chief Martinez, you have earned this promotion through exceptional technical competence, professional integrity, and personal courage. Your willingness to speak truth to power and your dedication to mission success make you exactly the kind of leader this command needs." As the reality of her promotion sank in, Sarah realized that she had not only accepted a new job, she had reclaimed her voice and her sense of purpose. The woman who had been silenced by trauma and abuse had become a leader who would use her position to protect others and ensure mission success. Harrison extended his hand to congratulate the Navy's newest Chief Petty Officer. As Sarah shook his hand, she spoke with a clear, confident voice that would have surprised anyone who had known her during her years of protective silence. "Thank you, Admiral Harrison. I won't let you down, and I won't let the mission down. And I promise that no one under my leadership will ever experience what I went through." Harrison nodded with approval. "Chief Martinez, I believe you will exceed every expectation I have for this position. Welcome to the leadership team." As Sarah left Harrison's office wearing the new rank insignia of a Chief Petty Officer, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had survived abuse, overcome trauma, and learned to speak with authority and confidence. Most importantly, she had discovered that her voice, when she chose to use it, could make a real difference in accomplishing important missions and protecting valuable people. The woman who had once never spoke back had found her voice and her purpose, and she would use both to ensure that others never had to suffer in silence as she once had.